BS and MS in Music and Art from Indiana State University. He taught in the public schools for 27 years. David has worked as a self-taught glass artist full-time for the last 6 years, as well as doing stained glass for 25 years and fused glass for 10 years. David has a studio for the last 15 years in Pelham, where he has taught classes in stained glass and fused glass. David has completed many commissions for churches, businesses, and residential. David has exhibited in 8 states. He has received many awards, such as Best of Show, 3-Dimensional at Amish Acres in Medallion, Indiana, and Art Crafts Fest, 1994. First in division in 1991, 92, and 96 at Amish Acres. Second in division in 1997 with Amish Acres, and Amish Acres Popular Award in 1981 at Amish Acres. Also the Award of Merit, 1994 at the Galena Art Festival. The Merit Award in 1994 at West Michigan Art Guild. Special awards in 1998 with the Grant Wood Festival. He has exhibited at Prairie Arts Council in Rensselaer in 1993, in the Craft as Art, and in 1996 with Trio. Please welcome David Harriet.
We're not in church, so come down where you can see. Not everything's going to project on the screen, David. A lot of it I'd like to pass around, and you're scattered all over the room, and it's difficult to pass them around. So I would like you to come down into these 2 rows if you can. If we have to, then we'll use other rows. That's a little better. We're still spread out, but we're better. Okay, first question I'm going to try to answer is, what is glass? Glass is a substance which is transparent. It's frozen. It's very high, call it sliver, point sliver, but its molecular structure is that way. Perfect glass is made from silica, and if you have pure silica, it has to be heated to about 3,000 degrees to make alternative glass. But that kind of glass is not used particularly. I've never even really heard that while doing my book. Most of the glass that you go familiar with is silica plus lime and either soda or potash. And most of the stained glass that is made is somewhere around 50% silica, and the other 50% is the ingredients. I don't know what percentages are. I'm no chemist at all, but the reason that the soda, lime, or potash are used is that by using those, the temperature that is needed to turn it into glass is reduced considerably. When I fire things in the kiln at 1400 degrees, the glass is not quite molten. It is, but if it went up to 1500, it is hot enough that I could take a tool and rake it and it would move. It would be very, very stiff. And when they make it, I think it is somewhere around 1800 degrees when they actually make the glass. I've been to a couple of factories and seen them do it, but I don't remember all the temperatures that they do. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the different kinds of glass that there are. Most of you think of glass as being transparent. It should be, or it can be. And if it is clear, what we call clear, and if both surfaces of the glass are parallel to each other and they're flat, light coming through will go through the glass and come out the other side in the same angle. And that's what you want in window glass. If you've got good window glass in your windows at home, you're not even aware that the light of any distortion at all when you look through the glass or when the light comes into the room. But as soon as you get any kind of surface that is not level, then the rays of light start to refract. And you've seen this in window glass that's got a wave in it. You know what it does. Well, it changes that angle, and that's a lot of what I am using as stained glass artist is purposely made to have all kinds of imperfections and surface tension or surface textures put onto the glass. And how do we get color in glass? Well, light going through this glass, forget this bevel right now, but if it were a piece of glass and light were going through it, note all the light rays go through it, the red rays, the blue rays, and the yellow rays, all go through the glass. If we put some kind of metal oxides in it, for instance, cobalt or iron oxide will block the red so that the red can't go through. So blue and yellow go through, and so we perceive what? Green. And that's how color works in glass. They put different metal oxides in, cobalt, cadmium, even gold. Lots of different ones. There are other things that are put into it too. Several years ago, my sister was up at Kokomo, which is one of the companies that makes glass, and she was happened to overhear the boss man complaining to another guy that they just couldn't get a good red anymore since the people that anyway. They made them take arsenic out of the glass, and what's that? What's the government thing that does that? Anyway, yeah, that's it. Any rate, he just complained that they hadn't been able to get a decent red since they've been able to take the arsenic out of the glass. So there are little things like that that they put in that make the glass certain colors. And he's right, Kokomo has a lousy red. Their red is very dark, and if it gets light, it turns orange. But there are other companies who have good red, so there must be some way that they have, And each of the companies has their own set of different glasses that they're known for, and it's very, very much of a hush-hush type thing. Keep your secrets from your competitors and all that sort of thing. Well, there are several different kinds of glass that are used. One is called antique or muff glass. And this glass is made, it's not old, that doesn't necessarily mean it's old, it's antique. It just means that it's made the old way. Glass is gathered onto a blowpipe. Glass is blown to expand it into a bubble or into a cylinder. The ends are cut off of that cylinder. You have a cylinder, and then they take something and cut the side, one side of that cylinder tin, and heat it and flatten it out. And that is called antique. antique glass. Antique glass generally has a pattern of little lines on it, running straight lines. And I'm told, although I've never really seen antique glass made, that they have some kind of a stiff brush, kind of like the brush that you use on a chimney sweep, that they run down inside that glass and twist it as they do it, and that makes all these little lines in it. This one is also seedy, and that means it's got little air pockets in it. I do want these back. These are to be passed along as they go. And that is a kind of glass that is the most sought after glass by most of the stained glass artists. There's only one company, well, two companies in this country that make one who makes it in large enough quantities to be considered. And the other one just makes a little bit, doesn't make much of it. In fact, I've never really seen it in the store in any of my suppliers in a long while. This is a second kind of antique glass. This one is a flashed antique glass. And to make this one, they gather a little bit of a very dense color, in this case red, onto their blowpipe. And then they coat that or plate that with a larger amount of some other glass that's light in color, usually clear, sometimes yellow, occasionally some other color, but most always clear. And that then is blown out the same way that the other antique glass was. But you now have a thin layer on top of one color on top of another color. And if you etch through it, either by sandblasting or acid etching, or even abrading it by scraping it, eventually you'll get through the thin layer and you will have more than one color. This one was done with a stencil, and so it's just white and red, but you can get various shades in between if you've got good enough acid etching or sandblasting. And of course, these antique glasses, being all handmade, are the most expensive. And these are mostly European glasses. A few years ago, I would say France and Germany. But now there is a Czech glass also on the market. And they make very good glass, but we didn't know about it until after the Iron Curtain came down. The second kind of glass that is used is machine rolled or commercially rolled glass. This is the more common kind. There are a lot of variations within this. Some of it is hand rolled, some of it is just hand ladled onto the table, some of it is completely mechanized. One company in Oregon has a system where the glass continues on a continuous leer. They have one sheet that goes through just continuously, and at the end of the line they cut it off. And when they change color, they've got a transition period, but it never stops. That one is all done by machine, except for one temperature, which I don't think we got here, which they've never been able to do with the machine. So they have to have they've got 3 guys that are trained for this, and I suppose they each have a shift or something, but anyway, they stand there and move it around to get the pattern. One of the kinds is called cathedral glass. And cathedral glass is any glass that is all one color and is transparent. This is an amber cathedral. This is an orange cathedral. Both of these are transparent. Now both of these have got a texture on the back. These are machine rolled, and one of the rollers is smooth and the other one has pattern in it. So this is called hammered, and this is called granite. And I guess that's it. Well, here's one that is called ripple. This one I think is partly done by, as the sheet is rolled out, and they manipulate the sheet, kind of wrinkle it up. It's not all done by pressing glass, pressing design of the glass. The second major kind of regular glass that we see is opalescent glass. Now opalescent glass is generally more than one color. It has a white base with some color in it, maybe even as many as 5 colors that are mixed into it. A couple of the companies make what they call 5-color glass. There are very few of them because most of the glasses are not compatible with each other. glass doesn't expand and contract. Different colors don't expand and contract at the same rate, so that the glass shatters. This is a piece of Kokomo glass, and Kokomo is known for its opalescent glass. It's called Kokomo Opalescent Glass Company. They make cathedral too. This is a dense one. There are others that are not as dense. And then there's a no man's land between the opalescent and the cathedrals that's called streaky. And this has got some that is milk glass in it, but it's not all that much of it. And you can see some of it is transparent. So that's a streaky glass. There's a streaky with an iridescent finish on it. When you get it, you can play with that and you'll see the iridescence on it. This one does not have iridescence and has very little texture on it, but it does have a little bit of bumps on it. None of these are perfectly smooth. They don't want them to be. In fact, as I get into the more expensive glass, you're going to think, well, this glass isn't as well made as the other glass. The more faults are in it, the more expensive the glass gets. Here's a glass that is called cat's paw. And when you get it, hold it up the light, and you will see that it's got little marks all over it, like the cat marks that cat makes when it walks in the windshield of your car. And this one is called mottled, and it's the same type of thing, but they're much, much bigger. And those are not machine rolled. Those are hand rolled. I haven't seen either of those two companies, but a couple summers ago, I saw a company that liked this, that they make this, and they were making a glass where they had one base color and two other colors that they were doing it. And they had the main guy who had the big ladle, and the other two guys who had little ladles. And they moved like ballet dancers. One of them would bring his thing across, dribbling hot glass all the way across, and then the other one would come across and dump his on. They never got in each other's way, and they knew where each other were all the time. This company makes a fairly large amount of glass. The room that they were making it in isn't as big as this room. It's a pole barn, and their warehouse is outdoors. They just park it out in the parking lot. So a lot of the companies, the point I'm trying to make is a lot of these companies are small. This one here is called fractured streamer glass. And this is another one that is what they call art glass. The fancier ones that I've been showing you here, they call art glass. This one is called fractures and streamers. And the fractures are the little splotches. If you look on the back, you can get your fingernail up against them, you can feel them. They have taken glass and blown it into a real thin. So it's paper thin, and then they shatter and threw it on the table. And then they took hot ladle of glass and made drizzles all over the table. And then they rolled clear glass or whatever color the base glass is over the top of it. This is a glass of a kind that Tiffany developed, and it's used in backgrounds to suggest leaves and branches, that type of thing. This is a glass that is called blue chip, and this is basically a piece of window glass. But it was sandblasted very lightly, and then they put a hoof and hide glue on the back of it. And the glue, as it dries, shrinks and chips off this pattern. Now, this is a very common glass. You see it all the time. Some of you probably got it in your bathroom windows. But it can be used in art glass. That's inexpensive. Then these glasses are sometimes made by spinning. Originally, they didn't. The first glass that they used in the Middle Ages was probably made this way. They gathered a little bit of glass onto a rod, blew it out into a bubble, and then cut a hole in the end of it, on the back side of it, and twirled it. And centrifugal force turned it into a sheet about so big with a bullseye in the middle. The bullseye is where the glass rod was attached. And then they cut that up. The glass was always thickest in the middle. they got to the point where they would use that bullseye in the middle as part of the design. They would use those in residences, and you may see windows with bullseyes in the middle. This is one that's made by a little company out in West Virginia that makes these kind. This is what's called a Rondelle. This one is not made any bigger than this. This is how big it was made to be. This is supposed to be like a center part of the thing. It's not particularly nice. It was one that sent to me as a sample of what they can do. I'm really impressed, but anyway, that's what that is. This is a jewel that is pressed glass. This was poured into a mold and pressed. This is a jewel that's a cheap one. Here's one that is a much finer one. This has got a design, well, they both got a design on both sides, but this one has got lots nicer facets. These are used as little jewels in windows and points of interest, little things like that. This last one is called a nugget, and these are made by basically they have glass and they have letters. While it's still hot, they let it stream off and they clip it off. And it falls on the table and makes these little blobs. And if you look closely on this one, you'll see that it's not round, and there's even one point where you can see where it cooled off a little bit before it quite got to be round. And so it has got a bit of a point on the mark. This piece of glass is a different kind of glass. This is called dull Vera. And I don't know what dull means. Vera is the French word for glass. This is a thick piece of glass, about an inch thick or 3/4 of an inch thick. These come they're poured into molds, and this has been cut with a saw. And these are made by putting these into a wall with concrete, or nowadays they don't use concrete, but that's what they originally used. Now they use some kind of epoxy. Resin. Sometimes they will take, or most of the time they will take a hammer and facet, chip off the surface of this to make it have facets. You've probably seen this in some churches. It's a more modern technique, and it wasn't used until the third part of the century. This last piece of glass is a bevel, and this is a piece of plate glass that has been ground along the side. And they point this obviously is to make a prism along the edge so that the glass will refract light out. These were used a lot in the 19th century and 19th century on. Mostly in residential trees, not too much in church work. Okay, besides this, there is natural glass. Obsidian is a natural glass. Occasionally you'll even find it in pure enough form that it can be used as glass is used. Now, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of uses for glass, and I'm not going to go into most of them. I'm going to mostly tonight talk about the history of stained glass. But before I look into the history of stained glass, because it doesn't get started until the Christian era, about 910, someplace in there, we'll talk a little bit about the glass. Earlier uses of glass. We don't know who invented it. We know that the Egyptians were using it, and as far as we know, they probably were the ones that in fact discovered it. It probably, though, just happened because silica is, of course, sand is silica. In the fire pit at some point, it got hot enough to make some glass, and they figured out how to control it and learn to make them. The Egyptians were using it at least by the 10th century BC. The 18th dynasty, which was from the 1570 to 1320 or thereabouts BC, made quite a lot of use of it. The 18th dynasty was the one that Tutankhamun's was in. Much of the jewelry in Tutankhamun's tomb had glass. Some of the jewelry, stones in it are fakes. By our terms, they prized them as much, if not more, than the natural stones they imitated because it was a fairly new technology and difficult to make. But a lot of the other things that were made, that look like lapis lazuli, for instance, is glass. They knew how to make glass that just by making one color, running it out and grinding it, polishing it, to make inlays. That's what jewelry there was. They also knew how to use it to work it hot. And I don't know exactly how they went about all this because they really didn't have any way of making a big crucible or a furnace, particularly like we would have nowadays to melt it in. But they managed to melt it some way with it. And they would make a vessel solid. And after they got a bottle shape, then they would grind down into it and hollow it out to make a bottle, which makes no sense at all. But they didn't have blood glass at this point. Some of the unguent bottles and perfume bottles that you found in the tombs of that period are made this way. And they are many different colors. And all the colors that we make nowadays, just about. They have red, which is one of the most difficult colors to maintain. They have red glass in their things. They learned how to cast glass and to fuse glass. Now, fused glass is basically taking glass that's cold, different colors of it, and putting them together and then heating them so they melt into each other. Let's see here. I forgot how I did the slides.
Just push overhead.
Lights?
No,
No.
just push overhead. I get it.
Jewelry from that period. A bottle. This is a little statue, a couple of princesses. And the next one is a scarab, a little scarab, probably not as big as that, probably. So these were all Egyptian from that period. The next one is a cup. That is not Egyptian, that is Roman. And that is from, I forgot the that's 7th century BC. By that time they were blowing glass. And this one has blown, and then they added the handle onto the side of it. And the decoration, which probably doesn't show up there very much, but they pinched with pliers to make it fun. The next page, the one here, is a Milfiori Vessel that is from about the 1st century BC. Now Milfiori is, that's probably can't even see it, 1,000,000 flowers. Little tiny flowers that all made, and then they stuck them together, and then they were blown on, or melted onto the big surface, and they made a bowl. We have things just like that that they make nowadays in this country or Italy, Venice particularly is known for Milfiori glass. So they knew how to make that from the 1st century on at least. The next two bottles are Roman bottles, and these are blown into a mold. The first one was blown into a mold, the bottom part of the vessel is. And then this neck was blown and attached, and the handle was attached also. This one was blown into a mold, and then the handle's added. This vase here, does anyone know what that one is, or is the picture good enough to be able to tell? A very famous vase called the Orton vase, and it's an example of cameo glass. Cameo glass is 2 layers of color, and when they eat through, in this case they abraded it, I think by grinding it down. And so that they ground through the white layer down to the blue layer. People have not, until just fairly recently, they thought the thing was ceramic. They've now determined it was probably made of glass. Up here at the top, over here, this is a vessel that shows, that is called a cage vessel. And this is another one where they grind, there's 2 layers. The inside layer, what looks like red in the left-hand one, and greenish in the other one. This shows you how the thing, when it's lit up, the light comes through the inside part, which is thin. And the figure is what was left after they ground away all the rest of the thing. Think of the time it would take to do that. And this shows the same vessel when it is not lit itself. The color of the glass even changes. This is about 5th century AD, so this is a little later. Now, other people who use glass in their things that, in a line that, how did we get it in Europe? How did it get to Europe? Well, the Romans used the glass also, but stained glass they didn't use. I mean, they didn't use it in their windows, in their houses, or in their public buildings, because their climate was warm enough that they really wanted for warmth, and so it was never used in Italy much. Most of the sources that I read think that it probably came about by way of the Muslims, which a lot of the things in Europe did. The Muslims in their homes used screens in the windows that were metal screens or other materials, wood, other things, that made a pattern of design work, fret work, and this controlled the light, and in some climates they would put glass behind this. And sometimes even colored glass. And there's a certain amount of conjecture that that's where the Christian church got the idea for stained glass. We really don't know where it came about, but the stained glass itself is an outgrowth of the Christian church. Without the Christian church, probably would never have come about. The Romans had also used mosaics a lot. Mosaic is small pieces called tesserae, which are arranged in some kind of a matrix, cement or something, to hold it all together. But light doesn't pass through it. They used them for decorations on the walls, the floors, all over. And a lot of the mosaics were stone, but a lot of them were made from pieces of glass, or combinations of different kinds of things put together. And that idea of making little pieces to make a design, coupled with the idea of the screen from the Muslims, it may or may not be where we got the idea for stained glass, but at some point they started making pieces of glass and fastening them together with some kind of something, and usually it was lead, to make a window. And as the church grew, into the northern part or into the colder parts of Europe, we started to see glass being used in church windows in stained glass. Now, the earliest piece of glass that we have that they can document is this face of Christ. Now, this is not a complete face, obviously. It just broke it. And they just happened to, they look it up. But they think it's from the 9th century, or 9th or 10th century. It's probably a face of Christ. And I can't tell, is that thing in focus enough that you can tell what it is at all? Okay, from here it looks terribly out of focus. That's why I keep asking. This is a plan for a church, typical church in the Middle Ages. It has a cruciform shape, shaped like a cross. This part of it is the nave where the people would stand. They stand because they didn't sit, they didn't have chairs. These two things are called the transepts. Those are the arms of the cross, and sometimes people would stand in those. The chancel is this area here, which is half of the length of the church. And right in this part will be the choir, which is where the monks sat, where they would chant. Not a choir in our modern sense of the word, but that was the only music that they would have with the monks singing. And they would sit in this, and then the high altar would be back in here farther. Now, it might not be all the way back here. It might be in here, and then there might be other chapels around. These side aisles are generally had little shrines and little chapels and things along. The glass would be in the windows. Now, in Romanesque architecture, which was what it sounds like, a development of the Roman style, where they used a round arch and big, thick walls, maybe 5 to 8 feet thick, in order to hold the building up. They had to have that. It was all they knew how to make with the Gothic. The Romanesque used a round arch, the Roman arch. And the Roman arch takes a lot of material to keep it up. And you had big barrel vaults, something like this. Now, these walls had to be thick, and if you put a very big window in them, your building fell down. You needed as much wall as possible to keep the building up. So you can see the sides of the windows here. These windows here are not actually windows. These are between the nave and the aisle. And so they're not holding up much of the building, so they're a little bigger over. But the Romanesque church never used very much stained glass because there wasn't many windows to start with. And when you put colored glass in the window, you cut down even further the amount of light that comes in. But they did use some glass, or stained glass, in the Romanesque buildings. In the 12th or 10th or 12th century, let me see, 10th or 11th century, developed what they call the Gothic style. Now, the Gothic style used a different kind of arch. Now, instead of having an arch like this, they have an arch like this. And this is made by what is called, instead of getting a barrel wall, which is not really a column so much there. This would be like 4 different posts. And that didn't show where Florida. Okay. Now, this would have an arch that would go this way, and an arch that would go this way. And by having this, and then by having thrust either down this direction and down this way. These are called flying buttresses, or buttress. And the buttress, the flying buttress just means that it doesn't have much there. It flies out over the edge. They were able to reduce the amount of material in this wall to practically nothing, at least compared to the Romanesque building. And now we have, remember how thick the wall was in the other one? Now the wall is just a matter of maybe a foot thick in some places. And it really doesn't need anything but just those posts. Doesn't really need any wall in between here. It's held up. It's an amazing that they were able to ever figure this out, because it's such a complete convergence from the Romanesque, that how they were able to get these to stand up. Well, as we'll see, that they didn't always get them to stand up, but it reduced the amount of material in it. And so you could have windows. And as they developed this style, they got bigger and bigger and bigger until the high Gothic, there was practically no wall at all of material. Stone, it's almost all glass. And so we have a much enlargement of use of stained glass there. Okay, now let's see. Here are some terms that I'm going to be using so that you can kind of keep track of what I'm talking about. A lancet just means the shape of the window itself. That's a lancet. Lancets are generally tall and skinny. There may be one lancet, or there may be a pair of them in a window. If you have a pair of them, then you have to have some kind of something in here. And as that developed, this became known as they got fancier and fancier, all this business that filled in that space. That became called the tracery. Another word that I'm going to use is rose window. A rose window is a round window. They were used very sparingly. Most churches had maybe three, a lot of them wouldn't have them all. But when you found them, they would be at the east end of the church, which is the end that people, west end of the church, the end that people came in, above the doors, up high, or up high at the two transepts. And that's where you would find them. Now, inside that rose window, the round window, there would be a whole lot of different kinds of tracery, pattern of shapes. And that's all tracery. Tracery just means all those odd little shaped pieces that of stonework that hold the whole thing together. And a medallion. A medallion is a round section, or not necessarily round, but usually round-ish within the glass section. And some of the earlier windows make use a lot of use of medallions. Why did they start to use these? Well, they were beautiful, but they also were used as a teaching tool. The laity was almost exclusively illiterate, even the kings. Most of them didn't know how to read. The only people who really knew how to read were a few of the monks, the ones who were scholarly. The parish priest, often as not, did not know how to read. So they were a way of teaching the Bible stories or teaching theological points. They might be stories about the Old or New Testament or pictures of the saints with the saints' different symbols to kind of remind the people who were looking at them what that saint, what his story was, that sort of thing. They might also be what's called a Jesse tree. A Jesse tree was a very popular motif in that it used what looked like a tree that went up through it. It had the various ancestors of Christ along. The Bible gives a list of them. Most of you never heard of, but there's a list of them. And in the Middle Ages, they used that a lot. That motif a lot. Let's see here. Here's a Jesse tree. Down here at the bottom is Jesse. That's David's father. And he's laying on a bed. Here's the thing. Out of Jesse grows a stem, a shoot out of Jesse, the Bible phrase. And there will be different kings. They show them all as kings, although they weren't. And as they go up, you'll see other ancestors along the sides. And here at the top is Christ. That's the general shape the window is. Now, in this one, you see these round things here. This is the modified Medallion Window. These are kind of a circle that ordinarily you can see as a circle in the middle of it. So that's the part of that design that is called a Jesse tree. Here's a closer view of this, I suppose it's St. Francis. Yes. It shows the kind of thing that you would have. Now this is probably about so tall in the window. I'm showing it to you to show that even though this is a fairly early window, it doesn't say here what the period is. Okay, this is 14th century. There's painting on the glass. The glass, the face has been cut out, and the features are painted onto it. That glass paint is fired onto the glass so that it becomes part of the glass. And the paint is basically glass, ground glass that was used. The robe has shading on it. The animals and things have details that were added with that. The background is what's called diapered. And that is, I guess I have to hold it. One of the things I want you to think about here is how flat this composition is. There is no depth at all, is there? In fact, there's not even an attempt to make it look like that it is real space. The figure and the birds exist on the surface of the glass cone. Okay, early stained glass, this is what you will see. As the periods go along, keep that in mind. How much depth does there appear to be in the glass? And that's one of the things that you can tell if you actually know that you're looking at old glass. You can tell kind of how old the glass is from that. This, 3 windows are from the Augsburg Cathedral in Germany, and these are 3 of the oldest 5 windows that are complete, that we still have. These are 11th century. These are 3 of Old Testament figures. This one is Hosea, this one is David, and and this one's Daniel. These figurative windows are, doesn't say there how big they are, but I think I've read someplace that those windows are about 4 to 5 feet high. They're not large windows. They're round arched windows, which you can't see because I'm up down there. These are Romanesque. The windows are small because of being Romanesque. The figure completely fills the glass. Even back that earliest glass that we have has painting. Some people today, when I'm doing shows, and I show painted glass that I did, and I didn't know anybody did that. They aren't thinking really because they say the church ones, but they haven't seen it in the show. Is that something new? No, it's one of the oldest techniques that, as long as they've been making stained glass windows, almost they've been painting on them. A little later, I'll show you a piece of painted glass that I'll pass around. As we get into the 12th century, we are getting into the beginnings of the Gothic period. I showed you the oldest ones that we have. There's very little glass still in existence from that earliest period. These pictures here are fragments or details from 12th century windows. The figure in the middle is probably Mary, and the figures on the sides, I'm not sure. Oh, this is from an Ascension window, so these would be the apostles. Mary here, and this black line is probably a space between the two lancets, but it also probably represents the cross, or leads your eye up to above here where Christ will be ascending into heaven. The figures are very elongated, very unrealistic. They're just almost like they've been stretched out, or they have no bones. They kind of float. You see there's a number of different colors, bright colors, red there, so they've always been able to have red, even though it's a difficult color to get. As we move into the 13th century, we are now getting into the Gothic style has been developed enough that we're now getting into the kind of churches that we know of as that you think of as being Gothic churches. For instance, the church at Chartres, or in Paris. These are, the window I'm going to show you is the North Rose window in Notre Dame in Paris. Can't begin to get all of it on there. Now, in each petal of it here, if you look closely, you can see that there's a medallion that contains a large figure. And then there is background around it of patterns that are abstract. As you get farther out, you get another set here of them. And here out, there is 3 cornered things, this shape with a medallion in the middle. That 3 shape is very popular. Not as loudly drawn as I did there. It reinforces the idea of printing. And down below, which I don't suppose you can see too much, there are bigger windows. Now these windows, I've never been to high Gothic. I mean, we've gotten to the point now where we can have that bigger window. And there's nothing in here but just stone. But this stone is not supporting anything other than itself and the window. It's not bearing the load of the building at all. Okay, she tells me that we better stop now for a break time. How long? 5. Okay. I'm sorry, I can't remember you. Okay. Yes, I remember that. You were. Let's turn down the stool. I mean, they're just okay.
That's all I can afford. This is a window from Chartres Cathedral, which is one of the most famous churches of this period. This is in France. From what I can see here, you can't even tell. I can't tell what the colors are. Chartres is known for its dark blues, rich blues, greens, and reds. This is a typical medallion window. There are round ones, alternating with four copper foil ones. And these have seams in them. And then there are smaller medallions along the side, which are partial circles and pocket forms. They have forms in them too, or little seams in them. In this picture, you can't make out any what's there. Here is a little bit of one section, which is this section right here in the window. Bottom of the big window. This shows a right? The carpenter. Shows a carpenter working. Now this may be, I think it's supposed to be Noah, but why are they showing that's a carpenter? Well, the Carpenter Guild paid for the window. And quite often, the guild or whoever put the window in would work their trade into it so that you know just what it was. Wheelwrights, here's the one with the wheelwright. Got their picture in some place in there too. That's common practice. The windows are made up of all these little seams. The window itself, if you stand back from it, it's just a nice, pretty abstract shape. In this same period, which is the 13th century now, we have these windows. These are called Vessel. Stay in place long enough to be right on the board. I will try right on the board. Let's see. Vessel is transparent glass. pretty much. It's grayish green, and most of that is paint. And these are, it shows, oh, there's 5 up there. There are 5. These are from York Minster in England. This is a rather famous set of windows called the Five Sisters. And Grisil became very popular in 13th century England. It doesn't seem to have much color. In the next century, the Grisil became popular in France. And England started using more color. Now, why did they use Grisil? Well, I've heard several different ideas why they used it. One of them was that it was hard times during the 13th century for England. They were evidently losing their war with France. England and France were always at war with one another. And one of the things was that it was hard times, so they couldn't afford the glass. Another was that most of the glass was being imported from France, and so it wasn't available. Others say that it had to do with these Sulpician monks, anyway, the followers of St. Bernard, who did not allow any pictures in his window. He didn't want to have pictures of people or even crosses in his windows, which meant crucifix. And so these are not really pictures of anything. They're just abstract designs. And if you can see it a little better, there are little spots of color, but they're just almost negligible. They're a very famous set of windows, and I can't for the life of me understand why, because I don't think they're very pretty. But they are considered one of the very best 13th century windows. And an excellent example of Grisil form. 14th century, 13th century is, by most historians, considered to be the best stained glass that's ever produced. And again, I'm not sure that I agree with that, but it's considered by most art historians to be the best glass that was produced. By the time we get to the 14th century, we are into a period that has quite a little bit of change. There are a number of changes. One of them is that now France is having a hard time, and England is in good shape. So English churches tend to be being built during that period, and there are not too many French churches being built. This is the period of the Black Death, which from 1348 to 1350, about a third of the population of Europe was dying from plague. They had just gotten over a famine 20, 30 years earlier that had wiped out a number of cities and reduced the size of some of the cities by a sixth. Not a good time. But during this time, we have a number of new inventions or new ideas that are put forward in this. One of them is the use of silver stain. Silver stain is a silver oxide that gets painted onto the glass, and when it's fired, it turns the glass yellow. It may be yellow, or it may be any shade up to orange amber. This is a good time now for me to pass around this face. This is the face that I have painted. The glass itself is a piece of clear antique glass. The paint on the front is a skin tone, which is called red for flesh. It's not red, never is, but that's what it's called. And this hair is a brownish like paint, and then the matte part is, and then the lines are black lines. And if you look, hold it up to the light, his hair appears to be yellow. And it is silver stained. And if you look real close on the back, you may be able to see a few little places where the stain is visible as kind of a scummy line where the little fire little overhead or something. I don't know exactly what it is. Sometimes it does that, makes a little mark. You can say it. This becomes part of the glass. You cannot feel it. But the paint you can very definitely feel. They're all fired on. Now, why was that a big step forward? Well, they could add color within a piece of glass. If you had a piece of white glass, like this one is, white, it's a term that a lot of people use for clear glass. They mean clear, they say white, they mean clear. I painted some color on, the face color is painted on, and the hair color is painted on, which is a brown or a gray. And that's most of the glass paints are browns and grays. Just to modify how much light comes through. Flesh tone is one of the few colors that is used. But I have flesh, brown, and yellow within that one piece of glass. And until I had silver stain, I couldn't have done that. This piece has got those colors, plus some transparent enamels, which don't come until much later. But this one, I'm going to pass around now and look at the yellows and the silver stains in here, because there are 2 or 3 different shades of yellows in this one, so that you can get, there's nothing that, well, there's one here that's, the bird's chest is almost orange, and some of the others are yellow. And if you combine that with flash glass, and you ate away parts of it, you could end up with 3 or 4 different colors within a single piece of glass. So they were able to get more colors without having to make a lot of pieces of glass. If they were having a saint and they wanted to have a halo around him, his head, before they had to paint, they had to have one piece of glass for his face, another for his hair, and another for his halo, or several pieces for his halo, because the tail went all the way around his head. You had to have several pieces to do that. With the silver stain, you could have one piece of glass that would encompass the head and the halo, and much easier to cut, because all you have to cut was a circle, more or less, and all this was painted on. So that's one of the innovations that was done. They also, at this period, started being able to make flashed glass, and that gave them more, again, more colors they didn't have before. They started using the paint in a little different way. They started using it to make more roundness to the figures, more control of the light. Also during this period, because they were able to, engineering things, they were able, advances, they were able to make windows ever larger. During this century, they had kind of a race. Some different dioceses or cathedral areas would have kind of a race. One of them would build a church, and then the next one had to build, the next bishop had to build his church a little bigger. And in England, they went for length. They kept making the nave longer and longer and longer. And in France, they kept making the nave higher and higher. And in Spain, they made them wider. Now, all of these things were, they pushed it as far as they could, and then the churches started falling down. Chartres, for instance, he said in the book was about 125 feet high. They pushed it up to something over 150, 157, I think. And that one's still standing, but they made a couple others that were higher than that, and they fell down. So they reached a point where they couldn't make them any bigger. They made the churches as big as they possibly could, but this was the period where they were trying to do all that. This is a window showing a new style. This is called the perpendicular style. And I don't know how well you can see it, but there are lots and lots of vertical lines that are perpendicular to each other. And you have large figures, and each of them is sitting under a canopy. And that canopy is made up of little spires that look like the tops of the Gothic churches. And all of this leads your eye up, 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 up. And that was a new style that was used during that period. 15th century. 14th century is still considered to be a high point of glass. It's still very good glass. Now with the start of the 15th century, we have the transition from the Gothic to the Renaissance. And the technology it keeps getting better and better and better, and the glass keeps getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And as you probably know, the Renaissance was an entirely new philosophy. A lot of it went back to the Romans, the classical Greeks and Roman civilization, and ideas of the human form as being very important. And so the painting or the drawing style became more realistic as the period went along. And eventually, by the time you get to the High Renaissance, they are very, very realistic but idealized figures. They also are trying to make the windows look like paint and trying to get depth in. Well, glass is a flat medium, and it doesn't work. At a certain point, they were successful, but after a certain point, it just got to the point where the style that was in style, the kind of art that was in style, just did not lend itself to glass, or stained glass at all. Here is a window from Flemish Window from the 15th century, and you can see that this painting style is much more realistic. You can see there is some space. It is shallow, but there is some. This figure is farther away than this dog, and it's done with perspective. It's not a real strong perspective, but it is a perspective. This window shows that same sort of thing, and you can see that this is the French window, and the 15th century, the French were using a lot of Brazil. So the figures now are made of clear glass, or white glass, with just a little bit of color behind it. Here's a German window. I don't know if anybody will see this or not. If you could see this better, you would see that the drawing style is much more primitive, much more like the Middle Ages. It's not like the Middle Ages, but it is much more conservative. The Renaissance mostly started in Italy and it spread north from there, so that even throughout the period, even though it's all one century, you may find glass in a number of different styles, a number of different developments towards the realism of the Renaissance. Here is 3 or 4 windows from let's see, Florence Cathedral. And Italy is not known for stained glass. And until you get, it's pretty late before you get to it. Can you see any of that? These are designed by famous painters of the period. Let's see. And they were successful as painters, but not necessarily successful as glass designers. These don't make a lot of use of the background, but they are still, they're much more realistic and much more like the Renaissance that you find period. This is still earlier than Michelangelo or Da Vinci, about a century earlier. As we get into the 16th century, things just tend to go to pot as far as glass is concerned. There's a definite decline. The decline that is in the 15th century is not so obvious. You see change, but they're still pretty successful. In the 16th century, they start trying to use perspective, much deeper perspective. I hope you can make this one out. This is a picture supposed to be Solomon receiving Queen Sheba. But if you look, you've got all these architectural background, and notice that there's no border. It's like a picture in a frame. I mean, a canvas without its frame. it imitates the painting, the canvas painting of the time, wall painting. And there is a real attempt to make depth in it, and it just does not succeed. The figures are very realistic, they look right, but they just don't work as glass. There are still some beautiful windows from that period, don't get me wrong. The really ugly stuff comes in the 70s. Now these two windows that I'm going to show you here are 18th century actually. 17th and 18th century. Now, 17th and 18th century are they're famous painters. The one I'm going to show you is Reynolds. Josiah Reynolds, famous English painter. And this is two of his windows. And they are two of the ugliest windows that you'll ever come across. First of all, he had no idea how glass worked. This is not really leaded. Look at the lines. They fight the composition, don't they? They have nothing whatsoever to do with the composition. There is no colored glass in the window. It is all paint. And most of the paint is pretty, light doesn't come through it, pretty opaque. These are from a set of windows of the Virtues, and someone called them the pale Virtues. The one on the right particularly just almost fades into her background. Well, that's the kind of work that they were putting out during that period. They really didn't know too much about stained glass. Josiah Reynolds was a very good painter, and he had to paint it after he didn't actually paint it, but they were painted to his design. It's not until the 20th or 19th century that we have any good art in stained glass. The 19th century is a period of revival, Gothic revival. It's also Victorian era. And the age of reason has gone out of style, and now we're into Romanticism. And the Romantics thought that the old windows were so romantic, so wonderful, that we just had to go back and imitate them. So most of what we're seeing now is imitation, but it revives stained glass. They go back to getting the idea that glass is flat. I lost my pages here. Now, this is Gothic revival, but if you look at it closely, it bears no resemblance to Gothic art at all. This is an English church, and the book says that it's probably the first American painting, or American window that was imported into Europe. That's very unusual. In America, most of the windows in the early 19th century, at least, were imported from Europe, because any self-respecting church that had any money at all wouldn't be caught dead using inferior American product. Europeans were, after all, the only ones that knew how to use stained glass. I'm being very sarcastic, but that's the way they felt. And so the American studios had a great deal of difficulty until fairly late in the 19th century of getting good commissions. And if you get right down to it, they knew as much about it, if not more, than the European. This is a reverse of it. Now, the figures are realistic, but they're placed in a sort of Gothic frame. There is a tendency to make the window flat. There's no depth. The figures are fully round, but they're not in space. And so they're better in that case.
Even though they are imitating, they aren't really imitating altogether. The next windows, you may or may not have heard of the Pre-Raphaelites. They were a group of painters whose philosophy was that we should get back to handcrafted things. And the reason they were on this big kick was that the Industrial Revolution was on now, and everything was, the smart people were into industrially made things. Well, this was reactions against that. And one of those painters was Edward Jones, and he happened to be a very good stained glass designer. These are a set of windows of his. The figures are realistic. They're a little romanticized. They're a little, well, they're not, they look a little weak. I don't know. But they are in a flat surface. And I'm showing you mostly because he's one of the best of the period, artists of the period. At the turn of the century, we have a school called the Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau is a rather short period of time, but it's had a big influence on stained glass design. This is a typical Art Nouveau design. Art Nouveau used twisted curve lines, a lot of idea of platforms. But the platforms are not at all realistic. They are pulled, twisted, tortured almost to get a pattern of flowing line. And a lot of the glass that we think of as being stained glass, the idea of what stained glass should look like, is Art Nouveau. While Tiffany and his period are not exactly Art Nouveau, they were strongly influenced by it. And we're now to that period. Tiffany gets a lot of credit for some of the things he didn't do. One of them was that he invented Opalescent Glass. Up till now, we had not been using, the glass ball was transparent. They painted on it, but it was transparent. He started making glass, although probably didn't invent it, but he was the one who used it first, used it most. That was called Opalescent Glass. And in America, it became extremely popular. And this is another thing that set up this rivalry between Europe and America. And if you were snobbish about it, you didn't want to have Opalescent Glass in your church because it was considered kind of lowbrow by the people who were Anglophiles or that sort of thing. But it became very, very popular. And his idea was, or what he liked to believe, was that he didn't use paint in his window. His idea was that all the texture, all the detail should be in the glass itself. That piece of fraction streamer that I put out earlier, that was one of his inventions, or he gets credit for it anyway, to put painterly detail in without actually painting it. He used glass that was called drapery glass, that they rolled the glass out, and then while it was still hot, they wiggled it around to make it drape. They draped it so that when you cut it just right and put it into the rope, you got folds in the rope. He claimed not to use paint at all. Now, that's a blatant lie on his part. It was pure promotion because he used paint. But he did mostly keep it to the hands and faces. And he used layers of glass. He might have up to 5 different layers of glass. He liked to hide the
painted parts under a couple layers of glass, so that when you ran your fingers over it, there wasn't any paint there. But when I show you some of these paintings, you'll see that there is painting. There are two glass people of the period that are very well known. Well, in glass circles. You probably aren't familiar with Lafarge, but he was a contemporary of Tiffany's and a rival of his. And most historians nowadays say that he probably was better. And a lot of the glass improvisation style, new techniques that Tiffany got credit for actually were Lafarge's. Lafarge wasn't a particularly good businessman and wasn't good at self-promotion. And Tiffany was wonderful at self-promotion. He also had his father's jewelry company name behind him, and he milked it for all it was worth. He never actually belonged to that company, but his company was named Tiffany also. This is one of Tiffany's windows from a series of four seasons. This is spring. And I don't know how well you can see that. Does it show up at all? Does that show up better? Okay. Now, there is no painting in this at all. This in here, that's streamer fracture glass. Here is some streaky glass. And the glass was probably made for this window to be used here. He did have some techniques that nobody else that had never been used before he and Lafarge started using it. There is also some scraper glass, although I can't really show you any particular pieces of it in this one, that were used. Probably some of these in here are probably very pretty. These little jewels down here are almost like that Dollavera that I had. There's a chunk of glass, and he just took a hammer to it, banged on it until he got it round that he wanted, and that it was just kind of stuck in there. And those refracted. And that's one of the things, some of the things that he did. He used this, remember the cat's paw and the mottled glass that I showed you? Well, here's some mottled glass in here and some cat's paw in different places. They were all invented at that period, that time frame, which would be late 19th, early 20th century. Now, I said he was good at self-promotion. He wasn't necessarily a great businessman because he ran his business bankrupt before he was done. But he had a longer run than Lafarge. This is a picture, a Pebble Window. Another innovation of his. You've probably never seen any of his windows like this. He didn't make too many. Some of these are actual pebbles. He went out and found some rocks. The quartzite, I suppose, because it had lead light through it. But they were just nice polished rocks that he'd find, and he would foil them into the window. A number of jewels around the outside, which were pressed jewels, kind of like some of the jewels that I showed you, only they were square. And this mottled glass that was used behind here. And this opalescent glass up in here has 3 or 4 different colors all streaked through it. These are all new ideas, American ideas. Europeans wouldn't be caught dead using opalescent glass for quite a little while. Here's another window. This one is Pumpkins and Beets, it's called. And there's no painting. All these little lines that you see down in here, but those tendrils on the pumpkin, it's all streamer that were worked out on the glass. And the different textures, it looks paper. That was his idea. He thought that glass glass should look painterly, but it shouldn't be painted. And I looked all afternoon, and I never could find a good Lafarge. I know I've got some, but I can't find magazines that they were in. He has one that is called Pennies in the Wind. And this is the only, this is not a good picture of it, and it's not the whole thing, just one section of it. But if you get right down to it, you're the better designer than Tiffany was. And I agree with this right on that. One more here. Now, this is the kind of Tiffany window that you think of as being a Tiffany window. This is wisteria and snowballs, or hydrangeas. And the snowballs are one piece of glass with all this modeling on it to make it look like snowball. You know what a snowball bush looks like. It's got all these round ones on it like that. And it looks very much like that. There are probably areas of this that have 2 or 3 layers of glass. These are obvious here. This one here, I don't know how much you can see it. This is a Magnolia Window, and this one is one that uses the drapery glass. These pebbles from Magnolia pebbles, actually, her glass is cut from drapery glass, which had all these ripples. It does come forward. Also, Tiffany is known for his lamps. And many people think that's all he did, lamps. Actually, he had, his company did pottery, jewelry, a whole bunch of things, metalwork, mosaics, as well as church windows and church or home windows, homes. The lamp started out as kind of a sideline, a way of getting rid of the little piece of glass that were left over. And probably were never as popular as the windows during his time. But during our time, they become very, very popular and very valuable. This is one of his dragonfly lamps. One of the most popular designs that you see reproductions of all over the place. A true Tiffany, though. Well, you can buy a good reproduction for $5,000 to $1,000. A true Tiffany would probably be 25, maybe 25, 30,000. Well, people are always saying that they've got Tiffany's, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. A lady came to me a year or so ago. They had this old lamp that they found in the lady's home in Earl Park, up in the attic. She says, I think it's Tiffany. Well, I said, I don't know anything about it. But she wanted me to go look at it, tell her where it was from. And it wasn't enough of an extra dollar. So I said, I know there's a place down in Florida, museum. And one of these books is Tiffany. There are 2 experts on Tiffany. One of them is McKean and one of them is Dunn. They hate each other's guts. They are very much in rivalry. But anyway, I put her in touch with the museum that McKean is in Winter Garden, Florida. And I didn't think anything more about it. I'm just pretty sure it wasn't Tiffany window or lamp. A year or so later, she comes back in. Remember me calling in? It was a Tiffany. It was an ugly, ugly, ugly lamp, and very atypical. But it was a Tiffany, and she got, I forgot what she said she sold it for. Quite a little bit of money. So they are, but you do start on occasion. we're running late. I'm going to show a couple of modern windows. After the war, Europe had to do a lot of rebuilding, particularly Germany. And German churches were rebuilt in modern style. And this is some of the windows that you find in German churches nowadays, or during this period, 20th century. And the reason I'm showing you them is that a lot of the glass that is made now is inspired by this period. It is very, very simple, very little color, completely abstract, but extremely important as far as trends are concerned. The one built here you can see is a steel glass frame building, and the walls are glass. Here's another one that's in a more traditional, this was probably into an old cathedral with a new glass. You can see that it's abstract. Lots of parallel lines. It's beautiful, but it's completely different than anything we've seen. The glass that is being produced nowadays, by that I mean the last 20, 30 years, and being contemporary, is a mixed bag, like every century is. But the new things that are being done are in the abstract field. Because the church is not as important in our lives as it was in the Middle Ages, the secular glass of this period is more important often than the church windows are. I'm looking to see if I have any other pictures that I want to show you particularly. Okay, I think now the house lights. Now, I'll talk a little bit, and I've got to quit just a minute, but I'll talk just a minute about what I do as a stained glass artist. As a stained glass artist, most of my work is sold at craft fairs, fine art shows, mostly. I do some autonomous panels, and these are examples of those. This one is a painted panel, and you'll have to get a hold of it and hold it up to the light yourself and see. There's some slides, but I don't have time to show all those slides on any of them, I don't think. This is painted, and it's a fairly traditional way of painting glass. There is, the yellow hair is yellow glass. It's not silver stain. The only silver stain that's in this one, there's a little bit of silver stain on the iris, which doesn't look yellow at all, and that's because it's on lavender glass. Another series of windows that I've been doing in the last several years are nudes that are done in transparent glass, all clear glass, different textures. And again, you'll be able to see this much better if you hold it up or look at it and see it through light. Different textures of glass. Some of this glass is very expensive glass, some of it is cheap glass. This glass, for instance, is machine rolled glass, which is made for office dividers, that sort of thing. This is a glass that is a medium price range. This is called Baroque glass. And this has got these wild swirls. The flesh itself is a semi-antique glass, which means it's not actually antique, it's not hand-blown, it's rolled, but it looks like it wasn't blown. This is antique glass, a seedy glass. Lots and lots of these air bubbles. That's the most expensive glass in here. There are several rippled glasses, that some of which have iridescence. There's a little bit of painting on it. The figure lines and the figures are painted on and fired on. This is put together using several different materials. Part see in there is the solder. But I'm passing it around so you can see how thin that copper is. The actual copper is only about a millimeter thick. And that I use a lot in some designs because it has a flow to it that I like. The line isn't always rigid, one width. The outside of this and some of the other lines are zinc. Zinc is made, channeling is made from a flat sheet of zinc which has been bent to get it into the shape that you have there. Zinc is fairly stiff, and that allows me to make the frame so that it won't stretch away. This is lead. Lead is a traditional material that's used. But lead, if you hang it, like this one here, if you hung in a window, eventually the lead will stretch away. And in a window, when it's glazed into a window opening, that's no problem. And lead was used because it expands and contracts and expands and contracts and doesn't lose its strength as much as some of the other metals. It's also soft enough that you can get it to go around odd shapes. The other piece over there is done in lead. Here are some pieces of lead with different configurations of it. These are H-canes and a U-cane. The U-cane is the outside. Here's a piece of H-zinc. The H is a piece of the glass that fit into both sides. My main line of product that I make at shows that I make nowadays is fused glass artwork. Fused glass is the same kind of glass that is used in stained glass, except that all of it has the same expansion quotient, so that I can cut them out, lay them on the base piece, put them in a kiln, heat them up to 1400 degrees, and they all melt together, and they'll stay together. Because as they cool, they expand at the same rate. And so that's how these are made. They are fused together, and this piece has probably 50 to 75 pieces of glass that were cut, laid on the base piece. And the base piece is 2 layers thick, and this piece is flat. There's a single piece of glass with other pieces that are laid on top of it. And they're fused together. And then after they've been fused together, they lay on mold and heated enough to bend in the shape of mold. This is a sculpture that is made by bending the glass, and it's made over the mold. The mold is under here, the glass is balanced on top of it, heated to not quite 1400 degrees, 1375. And the glass bends and falls down on the mold and onto the shelf and takes on that shape. Are there questions? And I know we're over time, so, but if you have a question, glad to answer. Okay, here's one other thing I use. This is a Mosaic Tile garden. I don't sell them, but I make them. Over here are some tools that I use, which you might look at.